In the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. No one ever told me that grief felt so much like fear. C.S. Lewis wrote those words as the opening line of his book, A Grief Observed. It is an intensely personal reflection on the death of his beloved wife, Joy. The book could be called The Death of Joy. And in it, he's trying to come to terms with what that meant and how he was to live after that decisive fact. His writing is candid, authentic, deeply honest. In the midst of dealing with loss and death, he asks, where is God in all of that? And he writes, when you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing God, so happy you are tempted to feel as if God's claims on you are an interruption. If then you turn to Him with gratitude and praise, it feels welcoming with open arms. But if you go to God in a time of desperation, when all other help is in vain, what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and the sound of a lock bolting and double bolting from the inside. And after that, silence. You remember the same thing seemed to happen to Jesus. My God, why have you forsaken me? And Lewis did not have the benefit of a slightly later theory of what we know as just the stages of grief. They are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. These are not so much discrete categories. They do not necessarily happen as stages one progresses through from beginning to end when dealing with a loss or a death. They're not necessarily in any order. They're descriptions of how people experience dealing with a loss, a type of death. Lewis wrote that he had experienced all of them, and sometimes several at once or all in a row. One day he was angry. The next day he was depressed. The next day, okay. No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. For Lewis, it was not necessarily being afraid, but the sensations of grief and fear were similar. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. It felt in his soul like deep-rooted fear. A pit in his stomach, being alone, laziness, forgetting what the smile of his beloved looked like. We as a culture have experienced a great deal of loss and types of death over the last couple of months. The obvious is those who have lost their life or those suffering from coronavirus or other illness. It is fear for ourselves of getting sick or unknowingly making someone else ill and being responsible for that. Another type of death is those who've lost jobs or school and the security that goes with them, the sense that seems to make of the world to organize our lives. There has been the strain on the economy, and we know those who are most vulnerable will be most affected. The hold on that elusive dream that imagines that everything will always get better is tenuous. We've lost the ability to gather with family simple pleasures like spring training or dinner with friends or being able to worship together in person. What do you miss the most that you lack now that you had only a couple of months ago? Now, while it is far from perfect, the world we knew, the one we took for granted, the one we are likely nostalgic about, all of that world suddenly came to an abrupt halt. And there's little sense of a new normal, whatever that means, will look like. We didn't even know at this point how long this new reality will last. It is indeterminate waiting, and that is difficult. There is a lot of death resulting in a lot of grief, and we might not even be aware of it yet. And that grief can be experienced as fear. Be mindful of that. In the life of the church, we have been in the season of Lent, leading to today, to Good Friday. And this time in particular recognizes these realities. It is a time, a season set aside to reflect on the fleetingness of life and all that is in it. And in this time in particular, we tell the story of Jesus, his life and teachings that ultimately lead to his crucifixion, to his death on the cross, the place, the hill we call Calvary. That's the story that we encounter today on Good Friday. Jesus experienced all the same types of death and loss that we do. He was cut off from everyone he loved, and everything that he taught seemed to be forgotten by him. He was betrayed and denied by his friends. The disciples Judas and Peter are symbols for this. He was misunderstood by his own people. The gospel that we just heard beautifully sung refers to them as Jews. And in this context, it means the people in religious authority. And those in religious authority were angry because they were losing control. Jesus was judged and condemned by the ruling power represented by the Romans and Pilate, who bargained for his life. He was rejected by the very people, the crowds he came to help. In his time of need, they chose the bandit Barabbas rather than the one they followed and had called Lord. Worst of all, he felt abandoned by the very God that he came to serve and to proclaim and to cry out from the cross, my God, you too, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus was well acquainted with sorrow, well acquainted with grief. Why did he do all of this? Why did he knowingly walk to Jerusalem to die on Calvary Hill on the cross? It is to show us the true, the full, the real nature of God's love for us. Because the cross is the epitome of everything Jesus did and all that he taught. It is the intersection of life and death, the divine and human, and what we know as sin and redemption. And it means that God is in the midst of all of that, all the suffering, the pain, working to bring good, working to bring reconciliation through it. And throughout the entire season of the church year, we tell the story. And when we boil it down, it comes to God created the world and all that is in it and called it good. Adam and Eve, representing the first people, chose their own way, as we still do, rather than the lives God intended for them and for us. It was really, to be quite simple, there in the garden. We were created to love God, love our neighbor, and love ourselves. But here's the key, to love ourselves and God and our neighbors as God does. We've never gotten that last part quite right. So God called the people, ones we name Israel, to be a model for this, to be a witness, to bear this in the world. God sent this people, and then prophets and teachers and commandments, and ultimately God came in person, in the flesh, in Jesus, to show us what it means to love. For all of this, from the beginning to the end, is a love story. The cross teaches us that love has a deep cost. To love means we will suffer. If we don't suffer from time to time, it isn't real. It is not true, but an illusion. For Lewis, he suffered when his beloved wife, Joy, died after just a few years, when she was no longer present. He was deeply grieved. We suffer when those things, those people we love, we cherish, hold dear, die, or diminish, and we are acquainted, too, with this grief, with this loss, can bring a type of fear. Jesus suffered because of his love for each of us. Death and loss, grief and fear are part of the story, but they are not the end. All the death, all the suffering, all the alienation from God and one another are reconciled, brought together on the cross. And Jesus took all of it upon himself or on our behalf to redeem them, to redeem us, to save us, to show us what it means to love as God does, without reservation, without counting the cost, without fail, to love without end.